There is currently over £31 billion held in unclaimed or lost old workplace pension pots in the UK, up 60% since 2018. Most people have no idea what they have in these accounts, what funds they hold, what charges they're paying. They just know it exists somewhere. It always seems a problem for another day. But if you never check these accounts, you'll end up leaving a significant amount of money on the table that won't compound for retirement. So in this video, I'll show you why this matters, how to find old accounts, and what to do with them to maximize their potential. So what's the problem here? So in the UK, by law, every employer must offer a pension to their employees. This is known as automatic enrolment. But every time you change jobs, that pension doesn't follow you. It stays with the employer's scheme, sitting in whatever fund you were defaulted into when you started. Most people never change the default fund. When you start a new job, you'll tick a box on a form and most likely never think about it again. And this is completely understandable because nobody tells you to do anything differently. But the problem is that default fund is usually far too conservative, especially if you've got a long time before you retire, and therefore could mean thousands in lost growth. This doesn't mean the default fund is necessarily bad. It's just the purpose of it is to be acceptable to the widest possible range of employees, a virtually impossible task. But it means it's not designed to maximize your returns. It's designed to produce a return with volatility in mind. What some providers do to be more tailored is create what's called retirement date funds, which match the retirement date of the employee, with the idea that you can afford to take on more risk when you're young, and the need to reduce that risk the closer you get to retirement age. A fairly typical approach to pension investing, and in theory, it's a good idea. In practice, it often starts happening far too early. Some schemes start shifting you into bonds 10 to 15 years before your target retirement date. So if you're 45 and your default retirement age is 60, your pension might already be reducing its equity exposure and tilting towards bonds. In fact, Nest, the UK's largest workplace pension provider, takes this one step further. Their highest risk fund isn't even 100% equity. So you could be 25 years old and have bonds in your pension, despite being potentially 40 years away from retiring. And it gets worse. They have a foundation phase, which aims to produce a return just above inflation while minimizing volatility. They claim both of these features are designed to help with motivation, keep people invested, and reduce the impact of investment shocks. For me, this is just taking a problem and trying to deal with the symptom rather than trying to fix the underlying issue, which is education. Ultimately, if you have 30 years left before you plan on retiring, holding a meaningful chunk in bonds is far from ideal, as they're designed to protect capital, not grow it. They're trying to keep investors happy. But you know what really makes investors happy? Growing their pension so they'll have more to live off in retirement. I get the point about people panicking and being put off by market volatility. But for one, 20% of people in the UK have never checked their pension. 2, you can't access it. And 3, wouldn't it be better if we put more effort into support and education by actually reframing market downturns as a good thing, because you'll accumulate quicker? So what does this actually look like in practice? Just before we look at some numbers, I want to make it clear this is just my view. But I believe for long-term investing, so anything more than 5 years, 100% equity is usually the way to go. Less than 5 years, you can't be as sure you're going to get a positive return, but the longer you go, the more chance you have of being able to recover from market crashes. In fact, if we look at this data put together by RBC, it shows how frequent market crashes have been following all-time highs in the S&P 500 since 1950. Just looking at past data doesn't mean the future will be the same, but it gives us a good idea. They found that a year after an all-time high, the market was down more than 10%, just 9% of the time. But push that to 5 years after an all-time high, and the market has never been down more than 10% in this time frame. The problem with pension funds is not just the asset split though, it's also their performance relatively, as they tend to be actively managed. But we'll come on to that. First, let's look at what damage bonds can do to your pension pot if included too early. This can be quite hard to calculate, but you can generally assume that over a long period of time, bonds will underperform equity. Their job in a portfolio is for stability, not outperformance. To illustrate what different funds would look like, I'm going to use Vanguard's target retirement funds, which have a variable asset split depending on when you're going to retire. So if you plan to retire around 2030, you would have a roughly 60-40 split, equity to bonds. If you're wondering why the splits don't add up exactly to 100, Part of it will be rounding, but there could also be small residual amounts of cash to aid liquidity of the fund. That's the split for 2030, but what about 2065? The split changes slightly, so it's now roughly 80-20. It's actually that split for funds from 2050 onwards. So it's not just Nest, Vanguard are also doing it too. You could be almost 40 years away from retirement and hold bonds in your pension. So how does this affect us? This is just going to give us a rough idea. If we look at the performance of a typical global index fund, I'll use Vanguard's FTSE All World ETF. Over the past 10 years, it has a return on average of 12.95% per year. If we now compare that to the 2055 Target Date Retirement Fund, which has an 80-20 split, we can see it has an average annual performance of 10.15%. Still decent, but nearly 3% less than 100% equity. If we also look at the 2030 fund, which has a 60-40 split, we can see it has an average 10-year performance of 8.27%, so another 2% lower. Now, there's no guarantee the future will look like the previous 10 years, but over a long period of time, it's fairly safe to assume that if you allocate 20% to bonds, you can expect to be giving up around 2% per year, as a very, very rough estimate. For some people, they may be comfortable with that, as they'll be getting a little bit more stability, and it also doesn't seem like that much. But let me show you what that 2% can do over a long period of time. The last 10 years has been slightly exceptional in terms of returns, so let's use slightly more realistic figures of 9 and 7%. So if you invested £500 per month for 30 years at 9% growth per year, you would end up with around £858,000. But if you invested the same amount at just 7% per year, you would end up with around £588,000. Is that increased stability in your peak accumulation years worth £270,000 at retirement? In terms of choices, there's going to be a difference between current workplace pensions and old ones. If it's your current pension, you will be quite limited in what you can do with it. Some providers do offer a few choices though, so it's still worth checking. But if you've got some old workplace pensions, you definitely have more choice. In a lot of cases, it's just a case of finding them, which we'll come on to. But you can combine them into a SIPP, which gives you 3 key benefits. You'll have potentially lower fees, simplified administration, and greater investment control. I recently did this with all of my previous workplace pensions, and it's now so much easier to manage. It's one of those tasks that's so easy to put off, but after properly looking into what I had, I'm so glad I did. And I just regret not doing it earlier. One of the pensions I had from when I worked at Invesco was this one from Aviva. It's a fairly typical pension fund that's actively managed and has a mix of equity and fixed income. Performance-wise, over the past 10 years, it has returned about 100%, which doesn't seem quite so bad until you look at what a typical global ETF would have returned in that same time. This is Vanguard's FTSE All World Fund again, and in the last 10 years, it has returned around 191%. I could have had nearly 50% more in my pension if I'd realised this earlier. And bear in mind, I'm 35 now. I did not need any stability or reduced volatility in my pension in the last 10 years. I barely checked it. But the first step to combining old pensions is knowing where they are. And a lot of people genuinely don't know which provider holds their old pensions. If you do know the provider, you can generally create an account to view the pension online, just with your national insurance number and a few other personal details. It helps if you have a policy number from a statement, but even if you don't have this, you should still be able to locate it. If you don't know the provider, you have 3 main options. First, look through any old documents you have. It could be old pay slips that may have the provider's name on. You should be receiving annual statements, but also look for setup documents you would have received when you started the job. Second, you could always email the HR department at your old workplace. They should be able to give you the provider's name. And then if neither of those options work, you can use a free pension tracing service run by the government. It lets you search by employer name and find the contact details of the relevant pension scheme. Once you've found them, you can then start the process of combining them. This is all done through the new provider. So the first step is deciding where you want to transfer them. There's plenty of comparisons online, and I've done my own breakdown of the best SIPPs on the channel. There's pros and cons to each one, and it really depends on what you want to invest in. Once you're ready to transfer though, the process is actually relatively simple. You open a SIPP and request a transfer. You provide the details of the old schemes to the new provider, usually just a quick form online, and they'll take care of the rest. Once the money is in the SIPP, you have the same control as any other investment account. You're not locked in, you can change the funds, and you can see exactly what you're paying. Keep it simple with your investments. The same general investment principles apply as if you were investing in an ISA. You want a diversified global portfolio that's cost efficient and suitable for long-term investing. The only differences are that you don't need to worry about liquidity or keeping some money back in case of emergencies, because you can't access this. And because it's generally a very long-term investment, you can afford to take on a little more risk and ride out some volatility, but that doesn't mean you should be totally gung-ho about this. This is what you'll most likely rely on for retirement. A global ETF as the core holding covers thousands of companies across dozens of countries and sectors at a very low cost. You could add some tilts to this as well if you prefer, or just keep it mega simple and not overcomplicate it. But if you're struggling to choose the right investments and you want to simplify your approach, I have a free ETF cheat sheet you can download that compares various ETFs across different regions and sectors. It makes it really easy to compare. It's linked in the description below. Tracking down pensions is not the most enjoyable of tasks, but that few minutes could literally save you thousands in the long run. You won't know until you look. I'll leave the link to the government pension tracing service in the description. If you've got any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments, and YouTube thinks you'll find this video helpful next. Thanks for watching.